Everybody, and welcome back to the Redeemed House of Jacob, especially on this special day. Today's the first day of unleavened bread, the high holy day after the Passover. So I hope very much that you all had a good Passover and a good first high day of unleavened bread. Tonight we're going to have a question and answer time. We went over the Exodus Passover and the crucifixion Passover last Shabbat, and there might be some confusion with all that we went over. We went over a lot, and we got some questions here to answer that we're just going to take them one at a time and tried to clarify, to re-clarify so there is no confusion. But first I would like to bring up a subject that in a way I've been teaching for many years in the Passover, that this year I come to realize that I might have been teaching wrong. And it's important that if we have something wrong, when we do discover the correct way that the Father is trying to get us to understand, then we need to clarify, and I repent for making the mistakes. But nevertheless, the subject is when they slaughtered the lamb in Jerusalem, and when they slaughtered the lamb on the first Passover and the Passovers after. Of course, when they were in the wilderness, they had to slaughter the lambs where they were. They were in Egypt. They did not have a temple, but they had a place where they could slaughter the lambs, and they slaughtered the lambs actually in their own gates. And it had to take place after sunset on the 14th day, which would be the end of the 13th day, going into the 14th day at Bein HaArbaim. Bein HaArbaim, I explained that the best that I could, and I hope it was very understanding. I tried to be as elementary as I can. Bein HaArbaim is a time frame between sunset and darkness. It is a rev, but Bein HaArbaim is a Hebrew word phrase that identifies a specific time, and it's important that we get this timing. Bein HaArbaim is from sunset till darkness. It's approximately an hour time frame. Some translations translate it as twilight. Some translate it as the evening. Some translate it as between the evenings, and even some translate it as afternoon. Now, between the evenings, the two evenings, and the afternoon would be very, very wrong. Because if that would be so, and they did not slaughter the lamb before midnight when the Passover took place, they would have missed the Passover. So it's just blatantly obvious that between the evenings on the 14th day, it cannot be possible. It's not logical, and it's not possible. Or afternoon of the 14th day, which would be going into the 15th day. Passover is the 14th day. And everything about Passover takes place on the 14th day. And at sunset the 13th day. There's a question here that's they're a little confused that the Passover was slaughtered on the 13th day. And here, question. So you cook it on the 13th day before sunset? No, that's not true. That's wrong. That will be a little bit of confusion there. And if I misled you there, it wasn't intentional, but I don't remember ever saying about cooking or preparing the lamb on the 13th day. There might be a confusion because I mentioned the 13th day. The 13th day is the last day of the inspecting the lamb for blemishes. From the 10th day when it is chosen till through the 13th day is 4 days of inspection. The 10th day, the 11th day, the 12th day, and the 13th day. That's 4 days. The lamb is chosen, and they inspect the lamb for 4 days. And then at sunset of the 13th day, that would be Ba'arev. In the 13th day, at evening, or Ba'arev, on the 13th day, the evening to come. Ba'arev. So that would turn into Bein Ha'arabayin from the sunset on the 13th day. Now it's the 14th day. The Hebrew day is from sunset to sunset. It is not the Greco-Roman, English, Western. It is not a day as we see it. This is a Hebrew biblical time day. And that day is from sunset to sunset. So at sunset, the evening to come on the 13th day, which is the 14th day at sunset, from that moment of sunset, from when the sun parallels or lowers below the horizon, it is still daylight. And as it goes down, it gets darker till darkness. It takes about a full hour from sunset to darkness. That is the time frame on the 14th day that you slaughter the lamb. You kill the lamb for Passover. So at that time, they killed the lamb, and they prepared the lamb, and they ate the lamb and the Passover meal throughout the night. And they could not leave till morning. They could not go out of their homes on that night. They had to stay in their home all night and could not leave till morning. So then, before morning, they had to burn whatever lamb was left, whatever Passover was left. They had to burn it before morning. Now, on the Exodus Passover, at sunset, after the 13th, that sunset becomes the 14th day. They slaughter the lamb, they prepare it, and they have that meal throughout the night before morning. If there's any Passover left, they would burn it before morning. And then at midnight, the Passover took place, where anyone who did not have the door lintels and the posts struck with the blood of the Passover lamb that was killed at Bein Ha'arabayin on the 14th day. So when they killed the lamb and was preparing it for the Passover meal, they took the blood and put it on the doorpost and the lintel. And when the Passover took place, the father would see the blood and he would pass over. Otherwise, even if you were Israel, if you did not have blood on the doorpost before midnight, when the Passover took place, the Passover and the death of the firstborn, then Israel's firstborn would have died, just like the world. So, to clarify, if Israel would have not understood Bein Ha'arabaim, the time frame of slaughtering the lamb. I know in Jewish tradition, they slaughter the lamb on the 14th day in the afternoon. Well, the Passover has already taken place, and the Passover meal is done. And they would slaughter their lamb on the evening or on the afternoon of the 14th day, sometime between the evenings, and then they kept their Passover on the 15th day. That is not what Scripture says. It's not even close. It is very specific about the 14th day. Everything takes place on that 14th day. Now, where I was wrong, by my opinion now, of the Passover, during the Passover, where I believe now I was wrong. For many years, I thought and taught that when they killed the Passover lamb, I taught that they had to slaughter the lambs behind the temple gates, behind the veils of the temple gates. It had to be slaughtered within the temple. Evidently, that's not true. My wife kept saying, well, how is that possible? Let's exaggerate a little bit and say we had 1 million families and a million lambs that had to be slaughtered by the priests within the temple. Then they take them home and cook them up for the Passover. Well, that would be very difficult. And then I got into studying a little bit, and I'm not going to get deep into this, but I'm going to share the foundational basics of what I've discovered in Deuteronomy 16. If you want to go there and follow along, it's Deuteronomy 16. It talks about observing the month of Abib. I went over very well what Abib is, to identify the first day of the first month of the year, so you can count day 1 to day 10. You choose the lamb to day 14. You have the Passover, and then day 15 will be the first day of unleavened bread until the 21st will be the last day, or the 7th day of unleavened bread. The 15th and the 21st will be a holy convocation, or a set-apart day, a high holy day. Passover is not a Sabbath day. Passover is literally a preparation day for the first day of unleavened bread. But here in Deuteronomy 16 it says, observe the month of Abib, and there's no questions about the Abib, so we must have that pretty clear and understood pretty much. So I won't cover it now, but what I want to cover is, where does the lamb get slaughtered? Where does the lamb get killed for the Passover, from the times on after the first Passover, the memorial? This is now a memorial. It's not a literal Passover. This is a memorial that we're supposed to keep, commanded to keep till the last generation. And I can assure you it's not the last generation. So observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim, or the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, Yahweh your Elohim brought you out of Egypt. Now, in the second verse, it says, therefore, you shall sacrifice the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim, the Lord your God, from the flock of the herd in the place, you sacrifice it in the place where Yahweh chooses to put His name. Go down to verse 5. You may not sacrifice the Passover within your gates, which Yahweh your Elohim gives you. So now here, they've got to sacrifice the lamb where He puts His name, but you may not sacrifice that Passover within your gates. But at the place where Yahweh your Elohim, the Lord your God, chooses to make His name abide, there you shall sacrifice the Passover at Ben HaArabaim on the 14th day at the going down of the sun. So, where does that leave us? Well, in Scripture, there's only one place that I'm aware of right now. If there's other places of specific intent, if there's other places that He uses for specific intent, and that place is Jerusalem. And what I've come to realize is that it isn't the priest that slaughter the lamb within the temple gates. That would literally be almost impossible. Although I know nothing with the Father is impossible, but He's not a man. He's not a God of confusion, and He's not a God that makes things literally impossible. So it has to be rational, and it has to be realistic. He is that way. And it cannot be a burden. So, what is the answer? You must, and not only that, in the millennium, when the Yeshua, Jesus, is He's reigning, and He is the King. He is sitting on the throne of David, the united kingdom, the whole house of Israel. If you do not come to the feast and festivals, what takes place? You'll have no rain, which metaphorically means you will perish, Hebraically. So during His reign, you must come to Jerusalem for the feast and festivals. Now, are we all going to fit within the gates of the city of Jerusalem? Of course we're not. But we cannot kill the lamb in our own gates. And that is clarifying outside the walls of Jerusalem to infinity around the world is in your own gates. Inside the Jerusalem where He puts His name, that's where everyone will take their lamb inside the gates when they come to Jerusalem, and they will prepare their Passover and take it outside into their gates, whatever that means. You will be in booths in their own gates and prepare and cook the Passover. So I wanted to clarify that. I always taught for many years that the priest had to slaughter the lamb within the temple gates, and I believe that is wrong, so I need to clarify that I was wrong, and I want to make things right. So, with that said, that's what I'm going to teach from here on out. If I'm wrong, then I find out I am wrong. I will certainly make it right. So, with that said, I hope some of these questions were answered already of when is the Passover lamb killed. And if we really get into the studies it's pretty obvious. Now, and what that means is you must study the Torah. You must study the Passover in Exodus 12, Deuteronomy 16, Numbers 33, Leviticus 23. You must come to terms and understand the Passover. So what you need to do is take it to the Father, take it to the book, and He will lead you. I promise. He will give you, if you put your mind only on what He says, take your mind off of what we've been taught in a lot of things, He will make it clear to us everything. He'll make it all clear to us. So now I need to open my phone here again. And let's see here. Here we go. There's what I'm looking for. Sebastian has sent me the questions that he got. And here, question 1. Well, I was inquiring about Passover. There are a lot of confusing scriptures about it. All I was trying to find out is when it begins. Like of the 14th of Nisan was a high Sabbath. No, the 14th of Nisan, it's the 14th of Abib, and in the calendar as it changed became Nisan. But on the 14th day is the Passover day. It is not the high holy day. It is the preparation day for the high holy day. The 14th day is not a Sabbath. And I just went over the Passover and how it goes down and how it is written in Exodus 12 and Deuteronomy 16, Leviticus 23. I tried to be very specific so you understood that the Passover is not the high holy day. If we were to go and clarify, because I think here this question is more about the crucifixion, Passover, high holy day. Torah does not call the 14th day high holy day. The 14th day, it is, sometimes they call it the first day of Passover, which establishes a new confusion because there's 7 days of unleavened bread, but there's actually 8 days including Passover. Passover, sometimes in translation, for lack of knowledge, they will call the first day of Passover confusing people as the first day of unleavened bread. And it shouldn't be done that way, but it is. Sometimes confusion is established that way. But in this question, 14th of Nisan was a high holy day, I think. I think it is the first day of unleavened bread based on what we see in Torah. No, the 14th day is actually Passover day. Like I just clarified, the 15th day will be the first day of unleavened bread. So if we go to Exodus 12, or you'll go to Exodus 12, and we'll read that so we can clarify and understand that the 14th day is not the first day of unleavened bread. It is Passover. And the first day of unleavened bread, the first day, high holy day, the high convocation, the high day Sabbath is the 15th day, or the first day of unleavened bread. So if we read 12:3, speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And of course, if it's a small family and it's a big lamb, you can have a neighbor come over and keep Passover together. You go down to verse 6. Now, you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. Now, I think I showed you this, and I don't think I need to show you. You can't read Hebrew anyway. If I was to bring up a Hebrew text, which I did on Shabbat, I brought the Hebrew text up when we did the fullness of the teaching. And I showed you the word Bein Ha'arabayin. It's not twilight. And it's not evening. Although Bein Ha'arabayin is a specific understanding of the evening. It is the time frame. The congregation of Israel shall kill it in this time frame of sunset, the start of the 14th day, which would be the sunset after the 13th day. A new day starts. At sunset on the 13th day, the new day starts. It's now the 14th day. Now the lamb, all the lambs are to be slaughtered within that time frame of after sunset to darkness, complete darkness. Okay? So that's a clarification on the 14th day. Then, after the 14th day, the lintel and the doorpost were struck with the blood. So at the Passover at midnight, the plague would pass over and the firstborn would not perish. But at the same time, after they slaughtered the lamb at Bein Ha'arabayin, or after sunset, then they prepared it for a meal, and they ate that meal throughout the night till morning. And by morning, if there's any Passover left, they had to burn it before daylight. And they could not go out of their home on that Passover night. So that all took place on Passover, 14th day, from sunset till morning. Okay? So I hope that clears up any confusion about the Passover, the 14th day. And when the lamb was killed, it was not killed on the 13th day. It was not killed on the 13th day. It was killed and prepared on the 14th day. It was eaten on the 14th day at night, and any lamb that was left over till morning on the same night, still the 14th day, if it's left over till morning, it had to be burned in fire. So I hope that clears up that question. If it doesn't, and you leave Savvy know somehow, I will definitely re-clarify. I'll re-clarify as many times as I need, just so everybody understands. There should be no confusion, because I promise you there is no confusion in anything the Father had written through His inspiration. So, question 2. I question, why would they get the leaven out on the 15th day? Well, the leaven has to be out before the 15th day. The leaven is, the leaven in your home has to be out before the 15th day. The 14th day, actually Passover day, is the day, the final day that you can remove the leaven, the preparation day for the Sabbath. Preparation days means you have to finish preparing for the Sabbath. So all the leaven needs to be removed from your home before sunset on the 14th day. It must be removed before the sunset on the 14th day. Now here, and we talked about the first day and of Passover and what have you. So here in verse 15 of Exodus 12, if you will, it says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your homes, for whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off. That's a translational issue, I promise you. The leavening of your home, when they're calling it the first day here, the first day, they're considering the preparation day, Passover day. Because when you go into the 15th day, that holy convocation, that Sabbath day, it is a Sabbath day. You may do no ordinary works on it. The only thing you can do is prepare your food. And that's written. And we went over that on Shabbat, last Shabbat. So I won't go over it into the fullness again, but the confusion is, and they do it in the latter writings in the four Gospels also, they talk about the first day of Passover, or the first day of the feast, excuse me, and it is not speaking of the first day of unleavened bread. It is speaking of the Passover day. It is speaking of the 14th day. And all of the unleavened you must have cleaned out of your home before the end of the 14th day, which is at sunset, and the 15th day begins. So I hope this question too is clarified and you understand. This person, and it's a good question. I question, why would they get the leaven out on the 15th day? Well, they do not. I would recommend you go back and reread Exodus 12, Leviticus 23, and Deuteronomy 16. They would be the three chapters that clarify the days that you unleaven your home. So, with that said, question 3. It says that Yeshua was alive on the first day after the lamb was already sacrificed. Well, he was. Yeshua ate the Passover. So, that people are confused about that because, like I tried to clarify on Sabbath day, Yeshua was not literally the Passover. Now, he was chosen as the lamb and his blood was shed, but he was not sacrificed as you would sacrifice a lamb. Now, I tried to explain that on Sabbath day, but I'll re-explain that. The Messiah, he was actually murdered. He was not sacrificed as a sacrifice lamb. I assure you, under the God of Israel, the one and only God Creator, there is no other God, there's one God, there's one instruction of life, and Torah, which is that instruction. And there was never, ever a person sacrificed under his rule. Now, the pagans have made human sacrifices, But the God of Israel never did a human sacrifice and never will. Now, how can that be? Yeshua died on the tree. Yes, he did. He died on the tree of death. And what that means is a sacrifice is killed in a merciful way. The lamb never feels it, not an ounce, not a moment, not the strike. And they bleed out. They are unconscious immediately. And it is a very merciful death. And then they were sacrificed, and depending on the sacrifice, they were a burnt sacrifice, they might have been a meal sacrifice, it's a sin sacrifice. There's different sacrifices that they shed blood for. And the Passover was the shedding of blood, blood for blood. The Passover, when they struck the lintel and the posts, they struck it with the blood, and the Passover passed over for the firstborn. But if the blood was not on the lintels, then the firstborn of the families would perish. So, life for life. Now, there's never been a human sacrifice. And anybody thinks about that in a logical sense, they can see that and they can understand that. But the confusion is, he was chosen as the lamb, and he was murdered on the tree of death. So, what does that all mean? Well, the Father, he wept for his Son, and he left this take place, because if this didn't take place, redemption cannot take place. Or no one would ever be able to reign with the Messiah and after the 1,000-year millennium be part of eternity. So, with that said, how can that be so? Well, we really have to think about this for a minute. Many people will say, well, Isaac was sacrificed by Abraham. No, he wasn't. It was a test from Yahweh, God, Elohim, to Abraham. It was a test of his faith. Now, how so? Again, I went over this on Shabbat, last Shabbat, and I'll go over it again here in a shorter form. When you have to understand, for one, the word hineni. The word hineni in Hebrew. I went over that a week or so ago on a Wednesday night. I went over Shalom, Shema, and hineni. If you don't understand those three words, you will never fully understand the scriptures written by the inspiration of our Elohim. Hineni is a word that says, here I am. But it's more than here I am. It is here I am, I will do. Now, a righteous man of the God of Israel, a true believer, you cannot be righteous if you are not living under the instruction of God. If you're disobedient to God, you cannot possibly be righteous. Just because a man is a good guy does not make him righteous. You must be keeping the instruction of the Father. Well, Abraham was a righteous man. So when the Father called out to Abraham, Abraham said, Hineni, here I am, I will do. He has no idea what the Father is going to ask him. And the Father says, Abraham, take your son. to the mountain where I will lead you, and strike him there as a burnt sacrifice. Now, as you read that story, it almost sounds like Abraham said, well, okay, yep, all right, I'm going to go do what you said. He packs up his donkey the next morning. He gathers the wood, he gathers the fire, and he takes a knife. Like it's no big deal. I mean, I'm going to go sacrifice my son. Wrong. He said, Hineni. And once you say Hineni to the Father, there's no recourse. You must do what the Father says. You can't get out of it. You can't say, well, I'll do it later, or maybe I'll do it, maybe I won't. When the Father cries out to you and you say Hineni, you have no way out, no matter what it is. Even Abraham having to sacrifice his son. Long story short, we know the story. He makes it to the mountain. He puts his son on the wood. He's in the moment of striking his son, and the messenger of the Father cried out. And that messenger says, now I know. I know your faith towards me. That messenger was our Yeshua, our Messiah. And he says, now I know your faith, that you love me as much as the pagans love their God, and they sacrifice. In the day of Abraham, it was not an uncommon thing for human sacrifices to take place. And the Father's test of Abraham was that he loves the Father as much as the pagans love their gods to sacrifice their own children. For blood sacrifice, they dipped their eggs in it. And the meal sacrifice, they actually ate those sacrifices. So, Yeshua was not sacrificed. He was not killed merciful. He was shredded. His flesh was torn. His skin was ripped out. His entrails were hanging out. They ripped his beard out. They ripped his hair out. It removed his face. He couldn't even be recognized. He was torn. He was whipped. He was shredded inhumanely to a point of they couldn't recognize him. After that punishment, he had to carry the burden of the cross of death. And it got to a point where he couldn't carry the burden any longer. He could not carry the burden any longer. And they had taken another man and forced him to carry the tree of death to the origin of the Messiah's death. So, misconception is that he was sacrificed. He was not sacrificed as a sacrificial lamb. Now, there's different ways to look at the word sacrifice. Did the Father sacrifice his Son? Yes, he did. But not as a sacrifice as you would sacrifice a lamb. He sacrificed his Son as he left it take place. He left it happen. His blood was shed for a people, a rebellious people, an adulterous people. He was punished, the punishment of the test of the adulterous wife, where her hair was shorn and the bitter waters. But he died the death of the rebellious son. So he was not sacrificed as a lamb would be sacrificed. There has never been a human sacrifice under the God of Israel, the Creator, the one and only God. The only human sacrifices ever done was done by pagan traditions of man. So he was nailed to the tree of death, and he died on that tree of death. So the question of the Passover that the Yeshua was living when the Passover was dead. Yes, he was. And the Passover was slaughtered by his disciples. He sent them out on the 13th day to find the lamb, and then at sunset they slaughtered the lamb, and they prepared the meal, and the Messiah ate that Passover meal at midnight. He understood Bein HaArbaim, whereas the Jews at that time was identifying Bein HaArbaim as in the afternoon. So when the Messiah was taken in the morning, and he was judged and whipped and tortured and tormented and shredded and forced to carry the burden of the tree of death, in the 6th hour, he was nailed to that tree. And at the 9th hour, he took his last breath. Now, he died the death of the rebellious son. It is the bloodshed for repentance, for that idolatry. You take anyone who tries to worship the God of Israel, the one and only God, the God that never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He died for the sinners that are worshiping other gods. They are rebellious. They are rebellious sons. They are adulterous wives. He died, or he was murdered, and I can read that to you. I can show it to you on here. I showed it to you on Sabbath. Let's see here. Let's go to Acts 5:30 and see if I got this right. Okay, in the New King James. They use different words. Different translations. Some say slew, some say killed, some say slaughtered, but they all mean the same thing. But here, the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, Yeshua, whom you murdered by hanging on the tree. Acts 2:23. Let's go to Acts 2:23. Acts 2:23. This tells you who murdered him. He was not sacrificed as a lamb. He was chosen as the Lamb. He was chosen as the Lamb on the 10th day. We went over that. It's very clear. It's very obvious. And on the 14th day, He kept the Passover meal the way you're supposed to. He kept it correctly. But then, during the day, still on the 14th day, He kept the Passover through the night, the way Torah says to do so. He was a Torah keeper because He gave out the commandments. He spoke out the Torah to Moses, if you read 1 Corinthians 10:1 through 4. He is obedient to the Father. He keeps the feasts and festivals. But He was murdered on a tree of death. Not the tree of life. He was murdered on the tree of death. And here's who murdered Him. Acts 2:23. Him being delivered by the determined purpose and the foreknowledge of God. God knew this was going to take place. This is where sacrifice comes in. The Father sacrificed His Son. Not in the way of sacrifice that we're trained to think the lamb was put on the fire. No. He was not sacrificed and He was not eaten. He was tortured. He was slaughtered. He was murdered. And His blood, the Father left this take place because foreknowledge of God, God knew it. He knew His Son was going to die a terrible, terrible death. Not a merciful slaughter, not a merciful death as a lamb. He was murdered a terrible death. You have taken Him by lawless hands and have crucified and put Him to death. So who murdered Him? The lawless hands. Torahless people. If you're not keeping Torah, the instruction of God, you murdered the Messiah. It's written. So, misconception, and I hope it clarifies the questions that Yeshua was alive when the lamb was already sacrificed. Yes, of course He was. He ate the Passover meal. But here's the thing. The Jews who killed the lamb on the 14th day at afternoon and ate their Passover meal on the 15th day. That is totally against Torah. When Messiah Yeshua died on the tree of death, the Jews were slaughtering their lamb. They missed the Passover. But the misconception is that the Messiah was sacrificed as a Passover lamb. He's called the Lamb. It's confusing, but you have to look at the reality of it. There is no human sacrifice through the Father. It's nonsense, and I hope your mind doesn't even go there to believe that. He ate the Passover the way He was supposed to and when He was supposed to. But in the morning of the day of the 14th day, He was taken and He was tried and convicted. And He died the death of the adulterous wife and the rebellious son. If you go to Deuteronomy 24, let's go there. Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24. I'll bring it up on here. Deuteronomy, here it is, Deuteronomy 24, starting at verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he found something unclean in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hands and sends her out of the house. When she has departed from the house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her also, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house also, or if the latter husband dies who took his wife, then the former husband, the first husband who divorced her, must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. So that's very important in this crucifixion, because he was punished the punishment of the adulterous wife. And what you need to do is go read Numbers 5. Numbers 5 explains the test of the adulterous wife with the bitter waters and shoring her hair. But you have to come to terms to understand that our Messiah, the God of Israel, the Messiah, divorced the house of Israel for adultery. If you go to Jeremiah 3, it tells you, Jeremiah 3. Now I know we went over this on Sabbath day, but this is important. You must get this and you must understand it, or you're not going to understand why he died on the tree. In verse 8, then I saw that for the causes for which backsliding Israel has committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, and went and played the harlot also. So the Messiah, he himself, divorced the house of Israel for adultery. How so? What is adultery? Idolatry is spiritual adultery. What is idolatry? Worshipping traditions of other gods and trying to worship him through those traditions, saying he said and it's okay. When you do that and he says it's okay, he becomes a rebellious son, because he is rebelling against the Father that says he is forever. He never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So through this adultery, they're saying our new Messiah says it's okay for us to worship God and worship him through pagan traditions of man. It's a golden calf. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's the tree of death. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is mixture, good and evil. And again, evil in the Hebraic thought in this context is not evil as a very, very evil man or a hateful person, or like I said, scrolling through TV, once in a while you come upon a movie where there's hideous looking monsters with teeth as big as your arm and drooling, hideous, evil. Well, that's not the Hebrew evil. Here, the good and evil. The evil is a man who rejects the Father and his instruction and keeps traditions of man, pagan traditions, instead of the Father's traditions, and tries to worship the God of Israel, the one God, through those traditions. That's the mixture. That's the tree of death. the tree of a knowledge of good and evil. It's the mixture, good and evil, and that's the death penalty. The golden calf is traditions of man. When they built the golden calf, when Jeroboam built the golden calf for the northern tribes, and when Israel came, while Moshe was up on the mountain, they built a golden calf. They were not doing away with the God of Israel. They were worshiping the God of Israel, and they called the golden calf the one who brought them out of Egypt, meaning we cry out to God, we cry out to Yahweh, but they tried to worship Him through that golden calf. They're trying to worship Him through traditions of man. Like today, the churches try to worship this God of this Bible through traditions of man, and His word's been done away with. We got a new God, a new Messiah. Now their Messiah is the rebellious son. He changed what His Father said is forever. He never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Now their Messiah, which is a false Messiah, says it's okay if we worship Him through the traditions of man, Christmas and Easter and what have you. So that is the rebellious son. So He died the death of the rebellious son, and He was punished the punishment of the adulterous wife. Now we know what the adulterous wife is. We know that He divorced the house of Israel for worshiping the Father through traditions of man, which is the death penalty. So, what happens? If a man gives his wife a certificate of divorce for adultery, which Yeshua did, our Messiah divorced the house of Israel for adultery, for trying to worship other gods and worship the traditions of other gods and say Yahweh said, the God of Israel. So if the husband dies, she's free to remarry. Go to Romans 7. Here, I just got it right there. Romans 7. Let me bring it up here. Romans 7. Best thing to do is just bring it up so you can see it. Romans 7. I can't. There. Romans 7. 3. I'm not going to read it all because we read it on Shabbat. If we read verse 3. So then, if while her husband lives, she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. While Yeshua lives, when you worship His Father through traditions of man, you're an adulteress. End of story. You can't get out of it. But her husband dies. She is free from the Torah, from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man, though she laid with other men. Yeshua, her husband, that gave her a divorce for adultery. If you go to Revelations, who is the bride? If you don't know that, who is the bride? Everybody knows the bride is the house of Israel. The 12 sons, the house of Israel. Even the gates are named after them. The foundations are named after the 12 disciples. And the 12 meeting messengers are the 12 Melchizedek. But the bride is the redeemed house of Jacob, the redeemed house of Israel. Now that couldn't be because He divorced the house of Israel. It's written. But He had to die to so that he can marry his bride. Now, not only that, he had to die on the tree of death. If you go to Deuteronomy 21, Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy, here it is. Deuteronomy 21. And we're going to go to 22. We should read it all, but we did this on Sabbath. I'm just re-clarifying. Deuteronomy 21:22. If a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which Yahweh your Elohim has given you as an inheritance. So the rebellious son has to, or dies on a tree. There is another way of stoning, but he was not stoned to death. He died on the tree. Why? Because of this rebellious people who are trying to worship the true God, the one and only God that never changes, and they're trying to worship Him through tradition of man. And that's a death penalty. That is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That is the tree of death. He died on the tree of death to shed, he died the death penalty. He died the death penalty for these adulterous, rebellious people. His blood was shed. He died the death penalty. Even though he was murdered, he died the death penalty. He was murdered by Torahless hands. Those who worship other gods' traditions and say the Father said. The Father that never changes, those that worship Him through traditions of man, are Torahless hands that murdered Him. He died their death penalty. And all they have to do to have life is to repent on His blood. He died your death penalty. And all you have to do is repent for keeping these traditions of man, saying that's for the Jews. That God is no more. We got a new God who changed things. He's now the rebellious son, but so what? So, the questions here that Yeshua was alive on the first day, which is the 14th day. It's not the first day of unleavened bread. He was not living on the first day of unleavened bread. He was killed on the 14th day. And before sunset, just like what we read here about the rebellious son, they hang on the tree. They must be taken off the tree before sunset. So they are murdered. He was murdered on the tree of death, and he had to be taken off that tree before sunset, just like it took place in the Passover. And yes, he was alive when the Passover lamb was killed, the true Passover lamb, and he ate that Passover meal. But in the morning, he was murdered, and he died the same time the rebellious Jews was slaughtering their lamb to keep the Passover on the 15th day. I hope you see the nonsense in that, and their sin in doing that. I hope you can see that, because I'm not sure I can make it any more clear than that. So, before I go on to the next question, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll try to finish up here, because I think I answered most of these questions. But we'll look them over, and we'll hit them all.